I now give the floor to Mr. Charles Jallow.
Thank you, Madam President. I begin by congratulating Sierra Leone on assuming the presidency of the Council, and I thank the presidency for the invitation to brief on a subject on which I have engaged extensively, both as a practitioner and regular teacher of international environmental law in and out of the International Law Commission. At the International Law Commission, in its most recent quinquennia, the Commission considered several environment-related topics, including the protection of the environment in relation to armed conflicts, the protection of the atmosphere, and sea level rise in relation to international law. I am therefore deeply honored to participate in today's thematic briefing on climate and security, environmental impact of armed conflict-driven security risks on this important international day. Specifically, I will focus on the potential for a coherent legal framework in fostering international cooperation and accountability, taking into account that armed conflict causes significant harm to the environment. In this regard, Madam President, I wish to limit my intervention to 4 main observations. My first observation is a contextual one. For several decades now, going back to the Gulf War in the early 1990s, discussions have taken place at the international level on the need for a coherent legal framework to better protect the environment during armed conflict. Under current international law, several bodies of international law bear directly or indirectly on the protection of the environment. Major treaties in the areas of international humanitarian law, international criminal law, international environmental law, international human rights law, and the law of the sea contain provisions that states and the international community may draw upon to strengthen the legal protection of the environment during times of peace as well as armed conflict. Some of the rules are so prevalent in state practice that they also form part of customary international law. The challenge is that much of the current international legal framework serves more like a patchwork of norms instead of a coherent legal architecture. 2 international instruments are worth highlighting in this regard. The adoption in 1976 of the Convention on the Prohibition of Military or Any Other Use of Environmental Modification Techniques, the so-called MMOD Convention, which was followed with the adoption in 1977 of Additional Protocol 1 to the 1949 Geneva Conventions. These 2 instruments added binding obligations for states to better protect the environment. Specifically, Articles 35 and 55 of Additional Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions prohibits employing, and I quote, methods or means of warfare which are intended or may be expected to cause widespread, long-term, and severe damage to the natural environment, unquote. Similarly, Article 55 not only provides that care shall be taken in warfare to protect the natural environment against widespread, long-term, and severe damage, the provision also prohibits reprisals by attacking the natural environment. Part of the challenge that the international community faces in implementing Articles 35 and 55 of Additional Protocol 1 is the difficulty of demonstrating fulfillment of the cumulative 3-part criteria of widespread and long-term and severe damage to the environment. The threshold is simply too high and too imprecise to fulfill in most of the cases. Building on those prohibitions, in Additional Protocol 1, Article 8.2 of the Statute of the International Criminal Court prohibits as a war crime intentionally launching an attack in the knowledge that such attack will cause widespread, long-term, and severe damage to the natural environment, which will be clearly excessive in relation to the concrete and direct overall military advantage anticipated. This means that attacking the environment could give rise to state responsibility for the parties to the conflict, but it will also result in criminal liability for the persons who engage in such acts. The attacks, at least when of a certain gravity, could be subject to investigation and prosecution by the ICC or under the complementarity principle within the national courts of any of the 125 states parties to the ICC. While it is of course significant that current international law provides some protection to the environment in the context of armed conflicts, the effective protection of the environment remains elusive. This is because much of the existing provisions enshrined in key international instruments, such as the Geneva Conventions and Additional Protocol 1, are designed for classic interstate wars, that is, international armed conflicts, and therefore do not necessarily apply to civil wars or non-international armed conflicts. The latter, of course, are the majority of armed conflicts in the world today. As UNEP concluded in a seminal study from November of 2009, this legal vacuum is a major obstacle for preventing the often serious environmental damage inflicted during internal conflicts. Madam President, my second observation gives me hope. Significant efforts are being made to strengthen the international legal framework to protect the environment. In this regard, while there is not yet a single binding universal treaty to regulate protection of the environment in armed conflicts, there are several so-called soft law instruments that have made significant contributions to clarifying and strengthening international law. Due to time limitations, I'll focus on the two most important ones. First, in 1994, with the support of the General Assembly, the International Committee of the Red Cross adopted the guidelines on the protection of the environment during armed conflict. Those guidelines identified legal rules derived from the law of armed conflict for inclusion into military manuals and instructions for armies at the national level. To consider developments at the international level, both in terms of treaties and customary international law since 1994, the ICRC has updated its guidelines on the protection of the environment in armed conflict in 2020 in order to facilitate the adoption of concrete measures to reduce the environmental impact of armed conflict. Divided into 4 parts, the guidelines cover a range of issues in 32 rules concerning general and specific applications of the law of armed conflict, as well as the means and methods of warfare. In addition to the ICRC guidelines, and I believe the executive director mentioned the International Law Commission, the International Law Commission, where I've had the privilege of serving in the last 9 years, completed a set of 27 principles on the protection of the environment in relation to armed conflicts, which, along with a preamble and commentaries, were adopted upon final reading in 2022. The principles, rooted in the law of armed conflict, international environmental law, and international human rights law, sought to strengthen the protection of the environment before, during, and after armed conflict, including in situations of occupation. The purpose of the ILC principles is to encourage states to take robust measures to prevent, mitigate, and remediate harm to the environment. The principles, which largely constitute a codification of existing law, seek to be comprehensive. They are further significant because they apply to both international and non-international armed conflicts. This helps to bridge the divide that exists since Articles 35 and 55 of Additional Protocol 1 only apply to international armed conflicts. Among the key principles is Principle 7, which is directly relevant to the mandate of the Security Council, providing that, and I quote, states and international organizations involved in peace operations established in relation to armed conflicts shall consider the impact of such operations on the environment and take, as appropriate, measures to prevent, mitigate, and remediate the harm to the environment resulting from those operations, unquote. Given the ongoing conflicts, mostly in Africa, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East, which I wish to focus on, we have seen not only significant loss of lives, but also, according to UNEP, and I quote, unprecedented levels of environmental damage in the Gaza Strip, damaging its soils, freshwater supplies, and coastline, unquote. Part 4 of the principles contain 3 key norms on the general obligations of an occupying power, which could be relevant in the context of Gaza and the occupied Palestinian territory. It addresses the sustainable use of natural resources of any occupied territory under Article 55 of the Hague Regulations, forming part and parcel of customary international law, and further recalls the duty of any occupier to take measures to ensure that activities in the occupied territory do not cause significant harm to the environment, including of other states or areas beyond national jurisdiction. The final 6 principles of the ILC principles will also be relevant given the current ceasefire, since they address issues relating to the post-conflict restoration and protection of the environment damaged as a consequence of the conflict. While these principles do not have a normative status, the specific aspects I have flagged are grounded in the law of armed conflict and are therefore applicable to that extent. Both instruments, that is the 2020 ICRC guidelines and the 2022 ILC principles, provide detailed guidance on how to better protect the environment in the context of armed conflicts. The two documents, while to some extent overlapping, complement each other well. Overall, they add greater clarity to existing international law, and to the extent that they are embraced and implemented by states and incorporated into their national laws and implemented in the field, they should over time strengthen the protection of the environment in the numerous armed conflicts around the world. Since this is an important issue of concern to the Council and focus of discussion, let me add that the spirit of those instruments from the ILC and the ICRC also aligns with the broader ICJ findings, requiring all states and the United Nations to take lawful measures not to recognize or aid the denial of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, including by infringing their right to permanent sovereignty over their natural resources. Madam President, that last comment brings me to my third and final observation, which is a proposal of 4 concrete and actionable recommendations of what states, including those in this August Security Council, could do. First, the Security Council could encourage states to take note of and even perhaps consider reflecting the ICRC guidelines and ILC principles into their national legislation, including in military manuals and instructions to armed forces and personnel in the field. The General Assembly, for its part, has already taken note of the ILC principles in Resolution 77/104 of 7 December 2022, the text of which was annexed to the resolution and brought to the attention of states and international organizations. On 1st March 2024, the UN Environment Assembly likewise adopted Resolution 6/12 on environmental assistance and recovery in areas affected by armed conflicts, in which member states recalled the ILC principles on the protection of the environment, and in operative paragraph 2, invited states to take note of the ILC principles on protection of the environment in relation to armed conflicts as applicable. Second, severe environmental damage, especially the damage that might contribute to the commission of international crimes, such as war crimes and crimes against humanity, should be prohibited as a crime under international and national laws. I had the privilege of serving on the international expert panel that advanced the legal definition of the crime of ecocide, which has been considered for future inclusion into the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. It is encouraging that the definitions we developed and variants of it have already been included in the national laws of various states. Third, in addition to encouraging states to better implement existing international law relating to the environment, especially the law of armed conflict, as the UNEP itself has recommended for several years now, a new legal instrument is needed to provide further protection for the environment. In the African region, for instance, several treaties already prohibit illicit exploitation of natural resources, which are exacerbated in the context of armed conflict. It is important that against that wider context, states establish what UNEP described as a place-based protection of critical natural resources and areas of ecological importance during armed conflicts. This is vital. As the International Court of Justice aptly explained in its 1996 advisory opinion on the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons, and I quote, The environment is not an abstraction, but represents the living space, the quality of life, and the very health of human beings, including generations unborn, unquote. Thus, the need for the protection of the environment in both times of war and in times of peace remain a fundamental imperative. Finally, as there are many conflicts around the world where environmental damage continues to occur, the Security Council could consider the establishment of a mechanism to monitor environmental damage in armed conflicts. Such a mechanism would also address claims for compensation in relation to damage caused to the environment, irrespective of the classification of the conflict as international or non-international in character. Such actions will fall within the Council's mandate under the United Nations Charter to maintain international peace and security, given the links it has itself drawn between environmental degradation and armed conflicts. Thank you, Madam President, and distinguished members of the Council for your kind attention.
I thank Mr. Jallow for his briefing.